Michelle.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Luke, for the introduction. I am excited to talk to you about decolonizing your design system. Before we get started, there's a little bit of a content warning. So some topics may be triggering. I do talk about slavery, racism, genocide, and white supremacy. All great topics for an early morning start. Please take the time you need to get the space and take care of yourself. I'm also available to talk at the Zero Height stand after the talk, so I'm always happy to talk about this topic and anything else. So before we talk about design systems, I want to kind of give you a little history lesson and some context around things. So we'll start off with white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion and detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. And it was a key justification for European colonialism. And so I think a lot of times when we think about white supremacy, we think about the enslavement of people. So this started about 1500, where people from Europe were, colonizing the New World, and they went to Africa, wrangled a bunch of people from Africa, and took them across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage to have them as laborers and enslave them. And I don't know how much you learned about this in school or when you were in school. When I was little, I didn't really fully understand the context of things. I knew, slavery was bad, but it's really bad. What they ended up doing was splitting family members from each other, tribes people from each other. So you were basically in a big group of people. You didn't know anybody. You couldn't speak the same language. You're away from your family. You're living in really harsh conditions. The Middle Passage was not fun. You could see that in this illustration, people were really jam-packed in there. It was hot. People didn't have a lot of food. People were committing suicide. It was really, really bad. And you were so broken, and that was a great way for these slave traders to control people. Later on, white supremacy kind of takes the form of acts of legislation. So in the 1800s, in the US, there was an effort to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And that was a railroad that was going to go from the East Coast to the West Coast and kind of meet in the middle and connect the continent. And in this aspect, they wanted a lot of laborers. So they got people from Ireland, but they also got a lot of people from China. And they wanted the labor, but they didn't want the people to stay. So they started these acts of legislation. So lots of politicians were looking for coalitions and people to vote against having Chinese people in the United States. And they just wanted labor, come work, and then leave. And so technically, on paper, I am second-generation Chinese American. My dad was the first to be able to stay in the country and have a family. But, technically, I'm fourth-generation Chinese American. So my great-grandfather came to build the railroad. He wasn't allowed to have families. So they weren't, part of the Exclusion Act was that women weren't allowed to come to the US and stay because they didn't want Chinese people having a family and establishing roots in America. So my great-grandfather had to have his family in China, and so did my grandfather. So there was definitely politics behind the way white supremacy was. There was also acts of cultural genocide. So starting in the 1800s for about 150 years, so this kind of well goes into our parents' generation of even in the 1950s and 60s, where there was an act to take Native American, indigenous people from America, put them into these public boarding schools run by churches, and assimilate them to European-centric culture. So this was a good way for them to sever their ties with their families, sever their culture, sever their language, and basically, culturally genocide everything out and really make them assimilate. And this might have come into the news a couple years ago because there were several hundred deaths of students at these boarding schools, and they were kind of hidden and kind of kept under wraps until recently. And then you can see a lot of documentaries about people who are, still alive today because they were going to these boarding schools in the 50s and 60s, where they talk about the trauma of what it was like to lose your family, lose your culture, and have to force to assimilate. Another thing, white supremacy also fuels implicit bias. So while these aren't, this example isn't as egregious as the other ones, I just wanted to show that it can take a spectrum of different aspects. So this is my husband and I. We got a house not too long ago, and there's a bunch of weeds in it. So we're like, okay, let's tackle these weeds. So we're out there gardening, pulling weeds, and a neighbor walks by with her dog. "Oh, hello, you must be the new owners." "Yeah, we are, welcome to the neighborhood." It was a nice little chat. And then my husband is like really not into weeding and not into gardening, does not like being outside, likes to play video games. So I was out there weeding by myself, which is fine because I like fresh air and stuff. So I'm out there weeding, and this is interesting because this happened to me twice. A neighbor walks by, "Oh, hello, do you live here?" And I'm like, "Of course I do. Like, why else would I be pulling this shit out of the ground, and it's a pain in the ass. Yeah, I live here. I'm not doing this for fun." I was like, what a weird question to ask. And then I realized the other guy asked, "Oh, you must be the new owners." He said owners, and that made me go, like, why didn't this guy say I was an owner? And then I kind of just remember, I was like, oh, because the white guy was cleaning the yard, he couldn't have been the gardener. He has to have owned the house. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this other guy must think I'm the gardener, because I potentially don't live here. And while this was like a very simple, basic conversation, it really, resonated inside of me as like, wow, this is maybe my place in society, that I'm a gardener and I don't look like a homeowner. And that was really hurtful. But centuries of white supremacy has normalized systemic racism and implicit biases. And I think when we think about, design systems, you're like, it's just a button, right? Maybe you're thinking like, a button's not racist. Michelle, don't be dramatic. You're being a little too woke here. And then also, everyone needs buttons. It's not we're like excluding people because we don't have buttons. Buttons are for everyone. And for the most part, UI elements do work. So you might think it's not really a big deal, right? But let's talk about who built our UI guidelines. So, as you know, Brad Frost created Atomic Design. The Apple Human Interface Guidelines was first created by a man named Bruce Tognazzini. And then everyone's favorite 10 usability heuristics for UI design was created by Jacob Nielsen. And material design was co-created by a man named John Wiley. And it's nothing against these individuals, but if you take a look at it, this is a very monochromatic, monogendered group of people who have built the foundations that we reference constantly throughout our work creating design systems. So, maybe you're like, well, yeah, but I have like a good design system team, or my design system team's, got some diversity. But I wanted to kind of look back at the Howey document report. So earlier this year, we released Howey document, and we added some demographic questions. And it turns out that over half of the respondents were from Western ethnicities. And the rest of everyone was less than half. 38% was the rest of the world. And this might not seem like a big deal, but if you look at it, this doesn't reflect the world. So looking at the world, Westerners only make up 17% of the population, and 83% is the rest of the world. It's everyone else. So clearly there is an imbalance here. And as a result, we are missing cultural considerations from a majority of the world. But it's not always intentional. And that's the thing, is like white supremacy is so commonplace we might not even realize it. So you might remember these M&M characters from a long time ago, and they still exist today. But back then they had this peach-colored flesh tone, and their skin tone was peach, and so it implied that they were from Western cultures. And in January 2022, in order to be more inclusive, they decided to put the M&Ms in these white tights, and you can kind of see their candy color shell color come through the tights a little bit, but it was to show like more inclusivity. And my friend and I were talking about this, and we were talking to one of our former coworkers, and he goes, this never occurred to me. I never thought about this, that this was like an issue or a thing, or I never realized that they had this peach-colored skin. And I'm like, of course not, because you are a white male. You didn't have to think about it. You had this privilege to think, oh, this is just like me. It's fine. So, it's very commonplace, and it's very easy to forget that white supremacy is around. So why does this matter? If you think about it, design teams create those foundations that our products are built from. And if the cultural context is missing from the foundations, it's going to be missing from the products. And if you weren't aware, designers carry a huge responsibility to serve the users. And if we're not serving everyone, we're kind of doing a disservice to everyone. If you haven't read this book, Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro, I highly recommend reading it. If you pick up a copy of the zine, he wrote an open source code of ethics, and it really explains the impact designers have, and not just people who use Figma or design tools, but just anyone who's coding, anyone who's making content decisions, anyone who's making decisions on behalf of users has a really big responsibility that we might not realize we have when we're just like, oh, I'm just designing this flow to put something in a shopping cart. There's a lot more to that. So maybe by now you're thinking, OMG, my design system might be racist, but I still don't know how to decolonize a button. And that's a good question. Spoiler alert, it's not always in the components. Rather, it's in the patterns. And patterns are part of design systems. So patterns are models for making things. In design systems, they can have prescriptive elements, like font, size, colors, but also guidelines that allow for situational flexibility and decision-making by the designer. So in that aspect, this is where the cultural context comes into play. Maybe you have more flexibility with the pattern to accommodate people who need more information on the screen or who need less, and really lean into the cultures of your users. So a really great example, and definitely recommend checking this site out when you get home or back to your hotel. IKEA does a really, really great job of providing a lot of different websites to over maybe 120 countries. And even within the country, you can specifically pick different languages. And if you go, this is a really good tour around the world if you want to think about it that way. If you go to Japan, in Japanese culture, they like to have a lot of detail on their website, a lot more context, because it helps them feel more confident about things. So if you go to the Japanese website, I know it's hard to see, but you can see that there's a lot more text on the screen, and even the popover displays before you click on it. It just shows up just to show, hey, this information's here. Western style, so this is the US in the middle, has a lot more, we like to favor white space and more visuals and progressive disclosure, so there's a lot less on the screen. And then if you go to the Egypt site, you can choose between English and Arabic, but the Arabic version is reflective, so it is designed right to left, because in Arabic you read it from right to left. So everything is on the right, so the IKEA logo, everything, and so it's just a mirrored. And it's really nice that these patterns can reflect that, and they can implement that in their UI. All right, so now you've seen this great example. You might be asking, how do I decolonize my design system? There are tactical methods, but I want to talk more about high-level things that you can do over the long term, because I think that is going to be more durable in the end. So you can hire, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You can do a lot more self-learning. And then you can also contribute. And I'll talk a little bit how you contribute. But when you talk about hiring, so it's really easy to hire people that are like you. You can relate to them. And the thing is when when you go to a design critique and you say, hey, I've got these designs, what do you think? You're going to get answers like, oh, I like it, it's cool, ship it, And that's great. And maybe you're thinking, okay, I got feedback from everyone else, but you're getting people who have common experiences like you, and they might not be accounting for everything. But if you hire for a diverse team and you show up to a design critique, present your design, hey, what do you think? You might get a lot of different answers. You might get, hey, I have a question about this. Something to consider is X, Y, and Z. You'll get a lot of different answers. And maybe some people will like it, and that's really good. But it will challenge you in a really good and healthy way. And that's kind of what you want. So I know a lot of people go, well, we would like to hire, but no one actually diverse, we'd love to hire diverse people, but no one actually diverse is actually applying to these jobs. And while that may be true, that just means that you have to go out of your way. So going to meetups to find people, outreach events, and working with universities, getting creative with how you want to find people. Just don't wait for them to show up in your inbox. And part of this is being okay with being inconvenienced to make a better team. Yeah, it does take a little bit more effort, but in the long run, it's worth it. You're building that team that's going to challenge you, it's going to challenge your teammates, and help you all grow. And just keep in mind that as a hiring manager, when I was a hiring manager, super busy, I totally get it. But a lot of the tools that are in place aren't accessible to everyone. So you might only get applicants from one area, but you really need to do that outreach, and it's definitely worth it. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to learning, I highly recommend doing a lot of traveling and observing. I know that traveling is a privilege, not everyone can do it, but seeing the rest of the world, I put a picture of a plane because this doesn't mean just take a road trip to the neighboring city, even though there might be a little bit of different cultural context, but really getting out there and maybe visiting a place you never imagined to visit. And while you're out there, not just looking at like what's happening, but really use your UX skills to think about, how are people doing things and why are they doing what they're doing? It's going to really help you understand more of what's going on with their culture. So a good example of this is I went to Japan a couple months ago, and I took a picture of people waiting for a train platform. And if you've never been to Japan, I highly recommend going. It is expensive to get there, but cheap when you land. So definitely, it's pretty rad. But the UX there is so different, and it really opened my eyes to like what else I might be missing. And it kind of led to this talk. So I think about, okay, people are waiting for their train, but thinking about the how, okay, the floor is marked very obviously for each line, and people are standing in the appropriate line. They're all lined up, very organized. And so I start to think about why, and I'm like, are the train lines confusing? Is it really bad if you get on a wrong train? Do they want to ensure that no one's going to make a mistake? And does having a lot of information just really ensure confidence for people? Because maybe people are nervous about traveling, and you want to make sure you're getting to the right place. I don't have the answers to this, but this is kind of like what I'm starting to think about. And I'm like, how does this play into the apps that they use or the websites that they surf? What does that look like? And what does that experience look like? The other thing, I call it couch traveling. I know, like I said, traveling is a privilege, and not everyone can go, but you can also learn so much without leaving your home now. And I think, reading travel books, memoirs especially, because they might have some more cultural context than other books. And as you're reading these things, think about the how and the why. And then, binge YouTube. There's so many great videos on YouTube. Well, there's also a lot of bad ones too. But definitely look at some of the travel videos. Like maybe you look at like how do you use the transportation system in Prague, and look at what that experience is like. There's also a lot of day in the life videos. And while that might not tell you everything, I think it just will shed some light on some more cultural context that you might not have been exposed to. And as you're doing this, continue to think about that how and the why, and not just the what. I think the other thing is meeting people. So especially at conferences like this, talk with people who are unlike you. Strike up a conversation. I think, the design community is a friendly bunch, so definitely encourage speaking with people here. And just like getting to know them and getting to know some cultural things. Also, when you're doing usability tests, test with a variety of people. Actually do usability testing. I know a lot of times we can skip that. But you want to usability test, especially with people that are not represented on your design team. It's a good way, while you're in the process of hiring a more diverse team, to get feedback from other perspectives that you might not have from before. And lastly, if you have a company that does localization for your products, speak with the translation team. They have a lot of good insight. Not only are they good at translating, but they also have a lot of the cultural context, and they love nerding out about this stuff. So if you have that opportunity, definitely do that. When I was at Citrix, I spoke with our German translator. I learned so much about German culture, learned so much about German language and how to localize for German language, but it was really cool. And then we just nerded out about a bunch of different languages. So tips for engaging in conversation. I think this can get uncomfortable for people, especially if you want to learn more about stuff, or if you're an underrepresented person, getting some weird questions and they're kind of awkward. So wanted to provide some tips. I think the biggest thing is to be patient and respectful. A lot of times, I know now that you've seen this presentation, you're like, I must learn about all the cultures, I must ask all the questions, and I need to know all the answers. But it's going to take some time. So, for example, rather than ask, where are you from? Like, really, where are you from? Because I am tired of that question. And I will give you a snarky answer. So you don't want to ask that. You can maybe say, hey, have you always lived in London? And that can start a nice conversation of like, actually, I moved here 6 months ago. And before that, I lived in wherever. And you might get some more information that you didn't expect to get, which is kind of cool. I think the other thing is avoid stating assumptions in your questions and focus on the question part. So use those like user research skills that you might have from doing UX or have worked with other user researchers. So rather than saying, I heard Americans love big trucks, is that true? Where you're kind of leading with this assumption, you can ask something like, hey, what's the transportation in the US like compared to here? And that might open a really nice conversation about the different ways people take transportation and what's used and what's not used, and you might be learning things that you had no clue about. So the other way is you can contribute and create patterns. So maybe you have different patterns that favor different cultures. So maybe you have a pattern that favors minimalism and a pattern that favors more context depending on your user group. But then I think, patterns, I get a lot of friction when I talk about patterns. People are like, I'm barely able to get my components figured out, let alone patterns. And then, patterns are confusing, like I don't know how to document them, which I did write an article about if anyone's curious. And then you're like, cultural patterns, that's even more work, like, oh, that's a lot. And then you might say, well, our focus is actually only on the US. We don't need patterns for multiple countries just yet. We're going for like a phase 1 MVP here. And the one thing that all these reasons have in common is that they're excuses. So yeah, I get it. Patterns are hard, but we all have to make them. Thinking about more cultural context is hard, but it's worth it. You want to reach those people who you're not reaching out to. And I never said that this would be easy, but it's worth it. So what's going on here is that we're undoing centuries of white supremacy. It's not something that you can just Command Z and make better. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. But the nice thing is that we don't have to do this alone. We can all do this together. So earlier this year, we had a Converge conference in the US, in San Francisco, and Brad Frost did a talk, Is Atomic Design Dead? And one of the ideas that he pitched was having a global design system, because we all have to make buttons. And how many times are we all going to make buttons? Like, it's a lot. Like, what if we just had a global design system that we pulled from, and then we themed for our company, or for our brand, for our product? And with the technology of design tokens, we can definitely do something like that. It doesn't have to be so difficult. It doesn't have to be so proprietary. So thinking about that, what if we had a global pattern library? And this would be a UI pattern library that considers cultural contexts. Maybe it even has some cultural sketches to help provide context. And I didn't say like profiles or personas, more like sketches of like rough ideas to kind of help give you some more context that you might need based on different countries and cultures. It's also an opportunity to leverage design tokens. Like, we have this technology now to scale, and scale even more broadly. So why not leverage those opportunities to make some really rad global patterns? So I am looking into making this happen. If you are interested in helping make a global pattern library, I would love to talk with you. I'm looking at something that's like open source and that people can easily contribute to. I think we can start small and go from there, so I'm happy to talk about it. So there is definitely a call for contributors, but I wanted to just mention, for my underrepresented people out there, only contribute if you are in the space to feel like you can contribute. Don't feel obligated to undo white supremacy. It's not something that we are supposed to Command Z and make better. For my represented people out there, use this as your motivation to learn. And I think a lot of times people want to be an active ally, but are not really sure how. So you can use this as a way of showing active allyship. You can help us figure out what kind of site to use, what kind of site to host, and how to contribute. And really, I think a lot of times people wouldn't mind talking about this stuff, but it can be tiresome. I'm kind of tired about having to explain, my cultural context often. So if there's a way we can kind of talk about some stuff, and then, represented people can unburden us and carry the weight and kind of do the documenting, that would be super awesome. So definitely, looking for contributors to help with this project. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to my talk. I will be at the zeroheight stand to talk more about this topic as well as other design system things. You can follow me on LinkedIn or on various social medias at soy-chin. There is this QR code which gives you the resources of all the books and more information that I shared throughout the talk. And definitely if you're interested in helping out, I would love to hear from you. So thank you so much.